Roberta Winters, president of the League of Women Voters of Radnor Township. As you may know, our primary election is May 18th, but people will start voting by mail even sooner, maybe by the end of this month. This election is very important, not only because it will allow registered Republicans and Democrats to select their respective party candidates for the general election in November, but also because of ballot questions on everyone's ballot. Every registered voter can vote on these ballot questions. That's right. Even if you are an unaffiliated voter or registered with a minor party, you can vote on the ballot questions. So let's talk about these important ballot questions. I've done many shows with our guest today, Jamie Mogil. She's an election fairness expert and the voter service chair for the Lower Merion Narberth League of Women Voters. She is my go-to person whenever there are elections in Pennsylvania. Welcome back, Jamie. Would you please share a little bit about yourself for our viewing audience that may not be familiar with your background?
Hi, and thanks, Roberta, for having me again. I always love doing these shows with you and working on League Matters because it's really about informing voters so that we can empower them to cast their ballot. And yes, I'm an attorney. I'm an election fairness expert. I practice election law and also have a private practice and a government relations firm. I'm formerly on the state board for the League and now am voter services chair for the Lower Merion Narberth League.
Well, you and I already talked a little bit about the races on the primary ballot, voter registration, and the options for voting in a different show we recently did. And we hope the viewers will go back and watch that show on Mainline TV 21 and their YouTube channel so that they have all the information about that. But as a preface to our discussion on the ballot questions, let's remind folks what they should always take away from our shows. And that's the way to register, to check your registration, and that's on votespa.com. And if you wish to find out more about the candidates, or in this case, also about the ballot questions, you can go to vote411.org. That's the League's trusted, nonpartisan resource for voter and election information. Now, let's get back to today's focus, our ballot questions. Can you, Jamie, help us understand just how these questions get to be put on a ballot?
Yeah, I think really we need to go back to start with the process of how we even get to the ballot questions. And that's really how we amend our Constitution in Pennsylvania. So if you look here at the slide, you can see that the PA constitutional amendments go hand in hand with ballot questions that end up for us on our ballot, whether in the primary and sometimes they appear on the general election ballot. Today, we'll be talking in more detail about the three, but first, changing the Constitution is a big deal. It's a long, arduous process, and it's tedious, and if it's not followed to a T, it means that they, being the legislature, have to start all over again. We saw that this happened with respect to a bill that was proposed with overwhelming bipartisan support regarding statute of limitations for minors that have been sexually assaulted. And that question led to the resignation of our recent Secretary of State because the process wasn't followed. So it's really important. So I'm just going to go through it quickly. Because the amendment is proposed via a bill, the regular bill process for the state legislature. But here's where it changes. A bill must pass both in the House and the Senate, the two chambers of the PA legislature, by a simple majority, and not just once, but in two consecutive sessions. So it's really important, not just once, but two consecutive sessions. And then the notice has to be posted of those bills, of those proposed amendments to our Constitution. And they must be advertised in every county newspaper. So again, if this isn't done, which is what happened with that instance I was telling you about, that means they have to start all over again. And then also there must be notice for the second passage. And that's really important because that's got to be 3 months before the election on which those ballot questions will appear. And then it goes to us, which is really important because we, as the electorate, get to vote yes or no on these proposed amendments. And it's very important also to note there is no veto power by the governor on constitutional amendment bills or questions.
Well,
yeah, and I just want to point out too, Roberta, just want to add, it's also very important because these bills overwhelmingly pass. From 1995 to I think about 2020, yes, 2020, 10 constitutional amendments were proposed and all 10 passed. So usually when it gets to this point, it means that they're going to pass. So it's really important that we inform voters about these questions.
well, it is a complicated process and one that we all need to pay attention to. But I'd like to take a look now at each of those questions separately that are going to be on our ballot. I know the legislation regarding these are pages long, and they're required to put them into what they call simple language on the ballot, but the simple language doesn't always tell the whole story. The first two questions on the ballot have to deal with the power to declare disaster emergencies. Now, just how did this become an issue anyway? We've been dealing with this for decades.
Yeah, before we get to these first two questions, it's good to have some background or context of why this came to be on our ballot. And it really has to do with right about where were a year ago. We know that the first two cases of COVID happened, and then the governor declared an emergency declaration. He ordered the closure of non-life sustaining businesses. So following up on that first emergency declaration, so by mid-March, he made a stay-at-home order that really was first county by county. I know here in Montgomery County, Delaware County, these counties individually did it, but then the governor made an order on April 1st extending the stay-at-home order to all 67 Pennsylvania counties. And that stay-at-home order, these emergency declarations, they last 90 days. I'm bringing these things up because they're going to come up in reference to the ballot questions we're going to talk about. So that stay-at-home order expired on June 4th. That same month, the General Assembly passed a concurrent resolution, meaning in time, with that governor's emergency declaration to end it. They didn't want, the majority party did not want the stay-at-home order to be in place any longer. Now, this was supported by a majority of the House and the Senate in our General Assembly, along with 3 Democrats in the Senate and 12 House Democrats. Supported terminating this emergency declaration. And really, according to the Republicans, the resolution was enough, that the governor's emergency declaration had been terminated. But the governor, in his interpretation, said the disaster proclamation had not been terminated by this concurrent resolution by the General Assembly. And instead, only a governor can terminate a disaster emergency. And so it went to the courts, and on July 1st, 2020, the PA Supreme Court ruled agreeing with the governor because the PA Constitution, which we're going to get to also, said, and this is important again because this refers to these questions we're going to talk about, it requires the Constitution that all concurrent resolutions be presented to the governor for approval or veto, except for resolutions, so these are the exceptions to that rule, legislative adjournment, internal affairs of the legislature, and constitutional amendment ballot measures. And so after this ruling, Governor Wolf vetoed the concurrent resolution that came before him to end his emergency declaration. And under the law, the General Assembly can overturn that veto. They need 2/3 legislative vote, but they fell short of that on September 2nd, 2020. But what they did pass last year was the second go round of the 2 ballot questions, which do directly address ballot measures on a governor's executive powers to declare emergencies. So here we are, and I guess we'll get right to the questions.
Well, here's the language for that first ballot questions, and we'll see when we vote, either by mail, which starts later this month in March, or in person on May 18th, how it's going to turn out. And this is what it says. Shall the Pennsylvania Constitution be amended to change existing law and increase the power of the General Assembly to unilaterally terminate or extend a disaster emergency declaration, and the powers of the Commonwealth agencies to address the disaster regardless of its severity pursuant to that declaration through passing a concurrent resolution by simple majority, thereby removing the existing check and balance of presenting a resolution to the governor for approval or disapproval. Well, it doesn't seem very simple to me. There's a lot of long sentences and words we don't often use in our everyday conversation, like unilaterally terminate, pursuant, and concurrent resolutions. I know I can vote no or yes, but what does it all mean?
Sure, and that's where the league steps in. We look at these ballot questions because they are difficult, right? The language of the actual question, I get asked this all the time, does come from the Department of State and the reviewed by the AG's office or state AG. So they can do their best, but it is kind of wordy. So we're going to give you a slide on each of the respective questions that we talked about today. So this slide tells you whether you vote yes or whether you vote no. So I'm just going to read it out, but we are going to talk about it a little more because even this may seem confusing to people. So what does it mean if you vote yes? If you vote yes on number one, that means you agree with giving the legislature by a simple majority, so 151, right, or one over the majority, the sole power to end or extend any governor's current authority under PA law to make disaster relief declarations. Now, what does it mean if you vote no? Well, that means you disagree with giving the legislature by a simple majority the sole power to take away any governor's current authority under PA law to make a disaster relief declaration. So one is you agree with the change, and the other is no, I don't want to see a change, but it can still be pretty confusing.
Well, that does make it simpler, but maybe you can explain just why some people would be for or against it.
Yeah, and I think we have to go a little bit further beyond just the yes or no slide. And so I want to make sure people remember that context that I talked about, the background of how we got to these questions. And this is a bigger discussion of just the current declaration around COVID-19 response. Proponents for this change, which did come from our majority party, the Republicans in the House and Senate, they likely want this change because they want to strengthen the legislature's ability to act to end or continue an emergency declaration without the governor's ability to veto. So I talked about how the governor usually has veto power. The proponents of this want to create another exception to those three that I gave you. So for instance, a governor can't veto a constitutional amendment. So after this is passed, it cannot be vetoed by the governor. So this would create another exception to that rule. And it weakens the executive power, so that of the governor, who was elected by the state to represent us as one individual and his cabinet. So it's really about the balance of powers going on here. But on the other hand, this is following our current law in which the governor does have the authority. Right now, he can we saw that play out with the COVID response. And there are checks and balances in place. I talked about the 2/3 legislative veto. So that is currently in there right now. Now, the proponents of this may say that's not enough, and we want to remove that veto power to overturn a veto, or as well as give the governor any veto or right of approval. And so this is much bigger than just the COVID response, because it could have unintended consequences, because it really decreases the individual task of implementing policy, right? Can you imagine now you're reporting, if you're an emergency like the Department of Health, you're reporting to 253 legislators. That certainly changes the dynamic here than reporting to the governor and his cabinet. So here's some other real world unintended consequences. It could be that if this passes and we have a majority party, which we do now, representing certain areas of the state, they could really use this to deny or even delay help and support to regions that are not affiliated with the major political parties. So we see that this could potentially influence these partisan divides, which unfortunately we already have. So we don't want to strengthen that kind of partisanship. It also undermines that function of the agencies I talked about, like Department of Health, that report to and work with the governor in emergency management. Right now, that is the governor who oversees emergencies and emergency declarations, such as working with our Department of Health. So now, like I said, they'll be, if this passes, they will be reporting to 253 legislators. We do have the second largest legislature in the entire country. So that's a pretty big task, and it could be quite a strategic and administrative nightmare.
Well, what do other states do? Are we the only one looking at this?
No, we're not. It is limited. I would say we do know, and this is also people ask me, well, what do other states do? So it's good that you asked that, Roberta. There are only four other states that require the legislatures approval to extend or end a governor's emergency declaration. And those are Alaska, Kansas, Michigan, and Minnesota. However, as with the majority of other states in the United States, our legislature does have the ability to terminate the governor's emergency declarations existing already, and that's with that 2/3 legislative veto override.
Okay. Well, now let's look at that next question that deals with emergency declarations as well. So I'm going to read that language, which is on that slide that you'll see on your ballot. Shall the Pennsylvania Constitution be amended to change existing law so that a disaster emergency declaration will expire automatically after 21 days, regardless of the severity of the emergency, unless the General Assembly takes action to extend the disaster emergency? The governor may not declare a new disaster emergency to respond to the dangers facing the Commonwealth unless the General Assembly passes a concurrent resolution. The General Assembly enacts new laws for disaster management. Jamie, can you help us again breaking this down? It sounds to me like this is a two-part question.
Certainly it is. I would say, just to preface this, constitutional ballot questions really are limited to a single issue. And I think right off the bat, as a lawyer, I see that we are addressing multiple issues. So this is, to me, already off the bat, something that should not come before the public. But let's get to it. And we saw that happened before in the challenge to the previous ballot question that happened with Marcy's Law, the league challenge. So what does it mean to vote yes, and what does it mean to vote no? And then we'll get a little bit more into it. So I'll read to you. It says, if you vote yes on this question, that means you're agreeing to change current PA law to limit a disaster relief declaration to 21 days, no matter how severe the emergency, unless and until the legislature votes by a majority to continue past 21 days, and any laws for emergencies would need to be passed by the legislature. So it is quite a bit. So what does it mean to vote no? That means that you agree with keeping our existing law, that any governor be allowed to issue an emergency declaration, no matter how severe the emergency, and that's for 90 days. And the governor remains the one to implement the necessary emergency actions. So again, you want to change the law or you want to keep the law.
So this concurrent resolution, what does that mean again? And the stuff about passing laws to manage disasters, what does this mean? I mean, pros and cons, how does this work?
Well, sure. It is a lot for all of us. You and I are not the typical voter either, Roberta, right? We work with the league, and I'm an election lawyer, so I see this, but I gave this to my mom to look at, and she said, what what's a resolution? What? So this is a lot to take in, but similar to our first ballot question, this is really about limiting a governor's authority to declare an emergency. But this question, it goes even further than the first question because now we see that there's a limitation on the number of days. The limitation would be 21 days instead of not the current 90 days. And that's no matter how severe the emergency. And a governor can't declare a disaster emergency without the legislature's involvement to pass a concurrent resolution. So that's to pass a bill at the same time. And the governor wouldn't be able to veto that resolution as it exists now. We talked about veto power. No power to veto as a governor would be able to now. And there isn't that checks and balances of the 2/3 legislative vote to override a veto. This is also completely changing existing law in that the legislature solely is responsible for managing a disaster or emergency if this passes, right? Right now, that's the opposite, it's the governor. So let's consider some real world examples. Let's talk about what happened in Texas. I have family there. It was certainly very stressful. Luckily, they're okay, but that is a serious disaster. And if this were to pass, we have a very large Commonwealth. And as I told you, one of the largest legislatures in the country. This means they would need to convene every 3 weeks, and just convening at all could be a hurdle when you face a real natural disaster like what happened in Texas. And that means even meeting virtually, because we saw in Texas they were without internet. So this would be again an administrative real nightmare and could potentially be very dangerous for our legislature to convene during a natural disaster. But some may view this simply as a limitation on executive powers again, and putting this more into the hands of our legislature. But I want to say that's really a certainly myopic, meaning kind of tunnel vision way of looking at this, because there could be really intense and dangerous consequences. Like I gave you the example about Texas. That those partisan and geographic considerations of limitations that may actually limit adequate intervention during a disaster. And that's because it would be 21 days every 3 weeks. So failure to act quickly and comprehensively and effectively could really worsen an already bad situation with a natural disaster or any emergency declaration. Lives could be lost, and it really could impact the ability to gain federal support and funding, which is tied to declaring an emergency. So we really want to make sure people think this through. It may seem just like complicated words here, but there really could be dangerous consequences for limiting the timeline and not really thinking this through.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, but these two ballot questions have to do with a balance of power between the legislative and the executive branches of the Commonwealth, in addition to the emergency declarations. And a fundamental principle of the League is that the powers of the government need to be exercised within a constitutional framework and a balance. And these seem like this is a power grab, so I think I know how I'll be voting. But there's a third ballot question, and I think this is really simple, and it just reads like this. Shall the Pennsylvania Constitution be amended by adding a new section providing that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged because of an individual's race or ethnicity? This seems like America and apple pie. Wouldn't most people vote yes?
Again, this is another one. It seems really simple. And I love that you equate America and apple pie. I would think the League is part of that too. But it is not as simple as that. So if we were to vote yes, so we'll go again to the slide where we talk about what voting yes and voting no means. And if you vote yes on this, then you're saying, I agree that Pennsylvania, state, county, and local governmental entities cannot restrict or deny an individual's rights, equal rights, under Pennsylvania law because of that person's race or ethnicity. Does Sounds pretty simple, right? And now we're going to say, what does it mean to vote no? I disagree with changing the PA Constitution because this equal protection clause in the US Constitution and federal law currently provides broader protections against denying or restricting an individual's rights on the basis of race and ethnicity. So it still might be confusing, but I think you're probably going to ask me to talk about what does it all mean?
Yeah, this equal protection clause and the broader federal laws. What's this all about?
Well, right. There are protections for race and ethnicity, well, really race under the Equal Protection Clause of the US Constitution and federal cases that interpret that section. So this will protect this new law, if it were to be amended and passed, and most people will probably look at this and vote yes, that it would protect an individual, not a group, but an individual based on his or her race or ethnicity under PA law. So that's separate from the US Constitution and federal laws. Thus, I'll give you a real world example. If a person were denied a job with a governmental agency, a PA agency, or they weren't admitted to a state sponsored school like Penn State, he or she could bring a claim under this new law, and that's an individual claim. So that's not a group claim for discrimination, which many may like when reading this, but others may disagree with that limitation on individual versus group claims. So many may hear this and think of minorities. We need to protect Black and brown people because of racism. But the other side of this is really, of this potential law, is that if a Caucasian person, a white person like you and I, Roberta, were denied a job or not admitted to a state-sponsored school, they too, okay, so it's not minorities, they too could bring a case if they felt they were discriminated for not being hired or admitted to a state-sponsored school. So it could open the door to what some call these reverse discrimination cases, which I doubt was the intention of this law. So of course, we didn't have testimony, we didn't have hearings or experts weighing in on this, but it also means that in many instances where race is specifically considered, like in government contracts, hiring, admissions that we talked about, it could mean a potential ban on those considerations, which are really important to kind of balance the inequities that we've seen due to racism. So another reason this law may be a no for voters, I think you know where I'm going and where I stand on this, is that it simply doesn't broaden the existing equal protections of the US Constitution. Actually, it narrows them, and that would mean adding categories of protected classes, as we call them, such as an individual's sexual orientation. That would have been great to see this broadening, but we don't have that.
Well, these ballots certainly aren't simple. And after listening to you, I have a pretty good sense of how I'm going to be vote because these are really important. Do you want to share anything else, Jamie, about the upcoming election and these questions?
Yeah, we want to remind people again that they can find all this information on votespa.com, vote411.org, the Trusted League resource, and any voter, any registered voter, whether you're the Green Party, unaffiliated, Republican, Democrat, you can all vote on these important ballot measures.
Well, I want to thank you, Jamie, for your willingness to address these complex election questions and legal matters that we often take for granted. I would also like to express our ongoing appreciation to Mainline TV 21 and their staff for their continued support of their efforts to inform the community about important issues. And voting is certainly one of these that impacts every one of us. And to you, our audience, we are grateful that you've taken the time to pay attention and hope that you will not only vote on May 18th, but share what you've learned today with your friends and neighbors. Your vote is your voice. Let it be heard. Everyone can vote on May 18th who's registered to vote. Thank you.